Kirkas Hetki. Suomen paras T-set käsittelevä ohjelma. Mä oon Malmöörä ja tänään aiheena on Jenkki Whisky. Menepä siis B-side-baariin juttelemaan siellä asiantuntijan kanssa. So, you've been serving American whiskey for a longer time back in the U.S. now?
Yes.
All right. Would you say you have a passion for this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
You know, from the time I started out in the hotel and restaurant industry, you know, you kind of start to get into different kinds of alcohols and spirits and that kind of thing, and it's always kind of more my interest. You know, I was never really so much drinking Irish or Scotch or Japanese whiskeys. I just always kind of had an interest in American whiskey and kind of learned it almost as a hobby, even though it was involved in work. I kind of took an outside interest in it.
Now, for those who aren't well acquainted with American whiskey, can you tell me what are some of the main characteristics of the product?
Sure. I like to talk about it because I think a lot of people think automatically, oh, bourbon is the only American whiskey and American whiskey is sweet and that's it. And there's really two different main types of American whiskey. Bourbon being the biggest one, which is made mostly from corn, so you do get sort of the sweeter taste to it. But almost, 30% of American whiskey now is also rye whiskey, which is primarily rye and has a very small amount of corn in it, so it's much more spicy.
Okay. In terms of whiskeys that you like, what are some of your favorite American whiskeys and why?
Sure. I actually tended to be a rye drinker for most of my interest in American whiskey.
All right.
Just because it was spicier and it had a lot more bite to it. You really felt more what you were drinking.
Yeah.
I like a nice bourbon. I think a nice sweet bourbon on a hot day with ice is really, really good. But rye gives you a little bit of that extra edge. So I always like drinking rye. Some that you can get here, Sazerac rye whiskey. That's a really good one. Knob Creek makes an excellent rye whiskey. And if you really want a rye punch bullet, it's about 95% rye. So you really get the rye taste.
Yeah. In terms of American whiskey versus the whiskeys of the world, what in these things makes it better for you? I mean, why would you prefer a good rye whiskey over a Scotch, let's say?
I think the biggest thing, and a lot of people aren't so familiar with the product, it's a little bit simpler, to be honest. Scotch is sort of a bit on a pedestal, and there's all these different Scotches that are kind of, of their own thing, and each one tastes very different and everything. And while there's a lot of character in American whiskeys as well, they're much more flexible in terms of making a cocktail, drinking them on ice, without ice. There's all sorts of different options. I mean, American whiskey pairs great with beer. So it's just an easier, more casual kind of hobby in my opinion.
So American whiskey, much like America, is about freedom.
I guess you could say that.
All right. So you say that American whiskey works well in cocktails. What kind of cocktails do you think American whiskey works best with?
I mean, it depends on the whiskey, but whiskey sours and old fashions, those were based on American whiskey.
All right.
Anyone that's using an Irish whiskey or a Scotch whiskey to make a sour, it's not really how it was initially designed to be.
All right.
And in a sense, Scotch whiskey tastes away on its own for a reason. Putting in the sour is really not good for the whiskey or good for the drink. Whereas bourbon is really, that's your sour drink.
So the difference between bourbon and rye, can you go a little bit deeper into that and kind of how they sit in your kind of view of whiskey?
Sure. So bourbon is the original American whiskey. All bourbons have to come from America.
Yeah.
There are places that make bourbon-style whiskeys. The guys right here at Helsinki Distilling Company, they made a bourbon-style whiskey that they're aging right now.
All right.
Which is based on the same principles as bourbon, but they can't call it bourbon. Just like you can't call sparkling wine that's not from Champagne Champagne. You can't call bourbon that's not from America bourbon. It has to be at least 51% corn in the mash bill, as they call it. Most bourbons tend to actually be more around 70% corn. About 70% corn, but 51% is the legal amount it has to be.
Right.
And the other grains in there tend to be barley and rye, which kind of cut the sweetness a little bit, give it a little bit more character. But corn is the main flavor that you taste.
All right.
Rye whiskey, there are no global distinctions for rye. There's a lot of rye whiskey that's being made in Canada. There always has been. And now there's a lot of rye whiskey being made in the Nordic countries as well. Because rye grows very well here. It just makes sense to make whiskey from it. But in the U.S., legally, rye has to be at least 51% rye. Although, again, most of them are more like 70% rye.
The craft distilling boom started in America as well. There's a lot of interesting stuff coming out there. What's your take on sort of whole American experimental spirit they're having over there?
I mean, American whiskey right now has gotten as crazy as craft beer. And everybody's making it, and everybody's got some new product with some interesting thing.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes the same way as craft beer. Some of it is really, really good, and some of it really, really interesting. Other of it just has a nice label. The biggest thing you see in American craft whiskey, especially, is that everyone has a story.
Yeah.
And the stories sometimes are a little bit embellished. Maybe they're just trying to sell it. And I think that I always recommend people kind of try to ignore the label and the story and just taste the whiskey.
Yeah.
A lot of people might have a low opinion of a Jim Beam or a Four Roses or something like that, but those guys have been doing this for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Jim Beam was one of the only distilleries still running during Prohibition. So they know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And their story is true. The craft is the most important part. With that said, we get a brand. We carry a brand called High West, which is a guy. He's only been making whiskey for about 10 years, and he actually buys different whiskeys that are already made, and he blends them.
All right.
He's one of the only people doing that, making American whiskey blends, and he's doing a fantastic job. So even though he's got no real story behind it, he's just a guy that really likes whiskey and said, I want to make blended whiskeys with American whiskey. I think that there's some quality in that, and he's making great whiskeys.
All right.
So there's great craft distilleries right now, and then there's the big guys that are still doing a pretty good job.
Yeah. Continuing on that, do you have some examples of interesting things craft distillers are trying in the U.S.?
Well, the blending is one.
Yeah.
There's another one, a really, really highly regarded one that we carry, Balcones.
Yeah.
They make a single malt.
Okay.
So they make a Scotch style whiskey, but with American barley. It's 100% barley, and it's in a Scotch style. It doesn't have the smokiness that a lot of people are familiar with.
Yeah.
Because they don't make it over peat like they do in Scotland.
Yeah.
But it's a single malt. You can taste the barley, and it's very interesting thing that they're doing too.
All right.
The other big thing, I guess, is different barrel finishes. Whiskey has to be aged in new American oak barrels, or used to be a whiskey in America.
Yeah.
But after it's been aged in those barrels for a certain amount of time, you can put it in something else.
Oh, okay.
So people are finishing it in a sherry cask or in a rum barrel, to give it a different sort of aftertaste too.
Okay. Would you say that the American whiskey scene right now is more experimental than some of the more traditional whiskey scenes?
I think that they have been, just like with the craft beer, they've been sort of on the forefront.
Okay.
Germany, you could consider a beer leader for a really long time. America came up with the craft beers, and now Germany's playing catch up.
Yeah.
Scotch, I just saw the other day Glenfiddich released an IPA-based Scotch. So they're playing catch up to American, craft spirits.
Okay.
So yeah, I do think that, like a lot of things, they are on the forefront.
All right. Are there some really weird things you've heard being done in the U.S. in terms of whiskey? Things that you wouldn't usually sort of associate with being done in that scene?
I guess I've heard about weird things that I wouldn't associate. Well, no, I guess I would associate this, actually. So there's one Jefferson whiskey that they age at sea.
Oh, okay.
They put it out on boats, and it rocks back and forth, and that has an effect on it. But, of course, that's what's been done with port and Madeira for ages. That's where we got those wines from, because they went out to sea and came back, and that's where they came from. Aquavit is aged that way a lot as well. So that's one thing that I've heard that's been applied from other sort of spirits that's happening in American whiskey.
Okay, that's interesting. All right, one last thing. What's your favorite American whiskey?
My absolute favorite is the High West Son of Borai, which we have here at the bar, at least for a limited time. We have a pretty limited supply of it. But it is a blend of bourbon and rye. Each aged about 6 years and then blended. It's a really nice, really different whiskey.
Okay. Can you describe it in terms of flavor profile of it?
It has the upfront sweetness of the bourbon, but then the rye kind of follows up and cuts right through it. So it's a spicy burst at the end and kind of makes you want to drink a little bit more.
Damn. Sounds good. All right, but with that, I'd like to thank you. Ja Kirkas Hetki kiittää. Seuraavan kertaan. Ciao.